So today we're going to be covering controlling a lens, talking about depth of field, aperture, focusing, and a few other details, as well as what lens should you choose and what lens should you use. There are a few attributes to a lens that you need to be aware of. There's your focus, which on a manual lens is going to have a focus ring oftentimes, which controls all the way from your close focus, which is the closest point at which your lens can keep a subject in focus, all the way to infinity. Other lenses might be autofocus or electronic, and those are often really useful tools as well. But the important thing to note between autofocus versus manual focus is oftentimes when you're pulling focus with a manual focus ring, the change in focus is going to look more natural than an autofocus, which often shifts in and out trying to get that perfect point of focus. Autofocus technology is getting a lot better these days, but it's still something that high-end cinematographers prefer to do a manual focus. And you can build out your lens to have a follow focus attached, but at its basic form, you have a focus ring, which is controlling the distance at which your lens is in focus. The other thing that you have on your lens is an aperture ring. Again, electronic lenses might have this controlled digitally through the body of your camera, but on a manual lens, you have an aperture ring which controls your aperture. And what is an aperture? It's literally a hole in your lens that controls how much light is coming through. So you can think about it like your iris in your eye, your pupils. When your pupils dilate or when they get really small, it's controlling how much light is coming in to your eye. The same is true with a lens. And when light is coming through the aperture, if it's wide open versus if it's really closed, it's going to have a different effect on your image. It's going to affect both your exposure and your depth of field. When you have a wide aperture, more light is able to come in and you're able to have a brighter exposure and your image is going to be overall brighter. But the other thing that's controlled by aperture is your depth of field. The wider your aperture is, the larger that hole is open. What is that bird sound? The wider your aperture is, the shallower your depth of field is. The blurrier the background is and the smaller the window of in-focus area you have. You're only going to have a very narrow in-focus window to work with. So that can produce a really cool effect, a blurry background, and look really professional. But if your subject is moving closer and further away from the camera, it's going to be really hard to maintain that focus. Aperture is measured in f-stops or t-stops, depending on what type of lens you're using. And as you start to get familiar with aperture as a concept, you'll start to recognize these different f-stops and what different f-stops look like and how much depth of field they allow you. So lenses are known by their focal length and the widest aperture, the widest f-stop they can open to. So this lens is a 50mm 1.4 aperture. So when you're choosing your lens, you want to consider all of these different things. You want to consider, what do you need it for? Do you need it for a documentary where you need to be able to quickly shift between focal lengths, zoom in and out? Are you in a controlled environment where you want to have the sharpest images at each focal length? Do you want something to look distorted and a little bit more grandiose? That might be a wide angle lens that you're looking for. There are so many other variations. You have anamorphic lenses, you have macro lenses for really close-up shots, you have tilt shift lenses. There are so many other variables, but the important thing to know is that if you know how a lens works at this level, you know the basics that are going to be relevant at those higher levels. A lot of filmmakers in this day and age are learning on DSLRs and cheap lenses, and when you can master the craft at this level, you know what you need to do when you start to work with more expensive gear, which is really awesome. There are different styles that you can get with different lenses. For example, a character running towards the camera shot on a telephoto lens, since it compresses space, it makes it look like that character is moving really slowly or is not covering a lot of distance. Conversely, if you film movement with a wide angle lens and the camera's moving, it's gonna feel like you're covering so much more ground more quickly. So if you're doing a car chase or a chase scene in general, that's a tool that you might want to employ. What focal length you're going to use is going to be determined by what type of story you're trying to tell and what you're trying to convey with the shot that you're using the lens to shoot. If you're looking to buy a single lens and that's all you have the money for, I'd recommend a zoom lens that can cover all the different focal lengths so that you can learn what the different focal lengths do at each range. But if you have a little bit more money, I might invest in some lower cost prime lenses so you can figure out what working with a kit is like and how changing lenses affects your workflow. There's so much more that we can go into about lenses, but the cool thing to me is that these basic principles apply at all levels. So if you're interested in more content about lenses, how they work, what they do, and what lens you might want to use for your project, mention it in the comments below so that we can make more episodes about this content. If you feel like you've learned something, please consider subscribing and check out our work at 7wonders.com.